Hello, welcome. Today's lesson is about Plato's Allegory of the Cave. By the end of this lesson, you should be able to give an accurate, detailed summary of the Allegory of the Cave and give some kind of an intelligent analysis of the symbolism in the story. So, without further ado, let's begin. Plato describes human figures imprisoned in a dark cave. And so he asks us to imagine or envision a dark cave in which we find prisoners. And these prisoners are chained in such a way that they cannot stand up on their own 2 feet. So I guess they're kneeling or sitting. And they're chained also by their necks, so they're unable to turn their heads from side to side. So they can only see what's directly in front of their faces. So they're forced to look at the cave wall in front of them. And Plato says that they've been there since childhood. And so we're to understand that this situation, imprisoned in the cave, forced to look at the wall in front of them, is the only thing they've ever known. So all they've ever seen is the wall in front of them. They've never been able to stand up on their own 2 feet. And on the wall in front of them, there are shadows. Because, Plato says, above and behind the prisoner, there's a fire blazing. Which lights the inside of the cave and casts shadows on the wall. And between the prisoners and the fire, says Plato, there's a raised platform with a walkway and a low screen like the kind puppet players use, where men walk back and forth carrying figures, statues and silhouettes and cutouts of objects, of plants and animals and so on, which have the effect of casting shadows on the wall. And so you have these, for lack of a better word, I'll call them puppeteers, who are creating this sort of shadow puppet show for these prisoners. And so maybe you have a puppeteer carrying a statue of a horse or a statue of a tree, which casts a shadow on the wall. So on the wall you might see a shadow of a horse or a shadow of the tree. Kind of a small detail, but might be worth mentioning. Also, Plato also says that there's, of course, an echo in the cave. And so the sounds that are behind the prisoners will reverberate off the wall in front of the prisoners. And so it will seem as though the sounds are coming from the wall as well. And so you have this situation where the only thing the prisoners have ever seen is these shadows. And the only thing these prisoners have ever heard are these echoes. And so you have to kind of make a little bit of an inference here. In such a situation, what would these prisoners make of the shadows and the echoes? What would they think? And naturally, wouldn't they believe them to be real things? Wouldn't they believe the echoes to be real sounds? Wouldn't they believe the shadows to be real objects? Because like all of us, their worldview and their beliefs are based on their experiences. And so if the only thing they've ever experienced is shadows, naturally they would believe that the shadows are real. How could they believe anything else? So this is the scene that Plato describes in the beginning of the Allegory of the Cave. I find, as you're summarizing the story, it will help you to think of this as a story in three parts. Most works of fiction, they have kind of a beginning, a middle, and an end. You have kind of where the setting and the scene and the conflict is described, and you have a rising action, which is what happens in the story, and then you have some kind of conclusion. And so let's call this the beginning of the story, the first part. So let's put kind of a Roman numeral here. Now, what happens in this story? So here's the rising action. Here's the middle of the story. We'll call this part 2. Well, Plato asks us to imagine that somebody comes into the cave and frees one of these prisoners. And so we have here sort of our protagonist, the freed prisoner. Plato says that somebody comes into the cave, frees the prisoner. Pay attention to what happens here. Compels him to stand. Notice he has to be compelled to stand. You can imagine that if he's been sitting or kneeling his entire life, that he will need help to his feet, that his balance won't be good, his knees will be weak, he will be unsteady. And so he's compelled to stand up and turn around. And I think the compulsion is important, the upwards movement is important, and the turning around is important. And so he's compelled to stand and turn around towards the light. And his instructor, who's freed him, points to the fire and the puppeteers and has the freed prisoner look upon them. And he says that those things, the puppeteers and the fire, are more real than the shadows that he had experienced before. And Plato asks us, what would be his reaction would he not be perplexed? Wouldn't he be bewildered, confused, puzzled, afraid, uncertain, or, in a word, perplexed? And so now I have to draw perplexed. Okay, so our freed prisoner is perplexed. And then what happens? Well, Plato says that there's a steep and rugged ascent out of the cave, and there's an entrance or an exit in the back of the cave. And the freed prisoner is, pay attention here, reluctantly dragged up the steep and rugged ascent out of the cave. This is important. This is the kind of detail that will separate the A students from the B and C students. I often have students make this mistake on the exam, that not attending to the details of the story carefully, and they'll tell me that, well, the freed prisoner, he escapes the cave, or he flees the cave, or he wanders out of the cave, or with the idea that the prisoner left the cave of his own volition, that he found his own way out of the cave. But Plato doesn't describe it that way, and if you think about it, that isn't what would be likely to happen. That is, he's perplexed and confused and uncomfortable. He's already left his comfort zone. He's never stood up on his own 2 feet before. He would probably be unwilling to venture further outside his comfort zone, and he would need a good push along the way. And so Plato tells us that the freed prisoner is reluctantly dragged against his will up the steep and rugged ascent out of the cave. And so it's a journey made unwillingly, it's an upward journey, and it's a difficult journey out of the cave. So he's reluctantly dragged up the steep and rugged ascent out of the cave and held fast in the sun. Blinded by the light. You can imagine how unhappy this poor prisoner would be at this point. I mean, he's spent his entire life in a dark cave, and now he's in the bright light of the sun, which blinds him and hurts him. In the same way that if you've ever, slept in and had the curtains drawn and the covers over your head, and your mom comes in and turns on all the lights and throws open the curtains, and it takes a minute for your eyes to adjust. So he's having that kind of an experience. So the sun makes him uncomfortable. And I would ask students to kind of help them think through the story here. To imagine what would happen if we were to give this prisoner the opportunity to return to his former habitat, and sit back down with his former companions in the dark cave in the world of shadows. Would he take that opportunity? Or put it more simply, what do you think that he would think better? That is, do you think at this point in the story, where he's blinded by the light, would he think that the world outside the cave, the world of light, is better? Or would he think the world inside the cave, the world of darkness, is better? I mean, it seems obvious that clearly he would prefer the world of darkness. Because so far, since he's left that world, all he's experienced is confusion, perplexity, discomfort, blindness, this sort of arduous journey. And so far, his experience since leaving the cave has been a very unhappy experience. Whereas before, he was comfortable in the familiar. And so he's unhappy outside the cave. But as time goes on, he begins to explore the world outside the cave. He begins to try to make sense of his new surroundings and his new habitat. And his situation improves. The first thing he recognizes outside the cave, as you might expect, is shadows. Shadows are the things he knows. And so as he's exploring outside the cave, he might start by recognizing familiar things, which are shadows. And then maybe from shadows, he works his way up to reflections. So whereas before maybe he'd only ever seen a shadow of an object, maybe he could work out that reflections of objects are like shadows of objects. I mean, it's different because they're in color, but they're still sort of two-dimensional representations of objects. And so maybe he could work his way up from shadows of objects on the ground to reflections of objects in the water. And then maybe from there, he could work his way up to actual objects themselves. So as where before, he'd only ever seen the shadow of a tree. Maybe he could then see the reflection of a tree and make the association. And maybe from there, he could actually see the tree itself and come to appreciate that the tree is more real and the reflection in the shadow is sort of a copy of it. And maybe from there, once he's sort of come to understand the world of objects and not mere shadows and reflections of objects, maybe he would turn his eyes upwards to the heaven. First the night sky, where he'd see the stars and the moon. And then finally, at last, maybe he can look upon the sun and what Paul says, contemplate the sun and begin to reason about it and appreciate that in a certain kind of a way, the sun is the source of all things, and it brings the seasons and the years and the crops and life. And by now, the prisoner has come to understand and appreciate the world of light. And he blesses himself for the change. That is, at last, he's happy outside the cave. And if we were to, at this point, ask him the same question we asked him earlier, which world is better? The world inside the cave, the world of darkness, or the world outside the cave, the world of light? He would surely say, having experienced both, that the world of light is so much better than the world of darkness. Indeed, Plato says that he would think back to his former companions and pity them. There's this line, very memorable, that, speaking of the prisoners, that it would be better to be the poor servant of a poor master and endure anything than to think as they do and live after their manner. Now, another mistake that students will make on the exam is they'll stop, when they summarize the story, they'll stop here. And they'll neglect to include the end of the story. Remember, I told you this is a story in 3 parts. There's the beginning, where Plato describes the world inside the cave. There's this middle part, this rising action, where the prisoner is freed, dragged out of the cave into the light. But then there's a conclusion to this story, where the prisoner returns to the cave. Plato says that he returns out of a sense of pity or obligation or duty to his former companions. That is, he goes back to the cave to tell the prisoners what he's seen. And so this is the 3rd part, in which the prisoner returns to the cave. So here I imagine him kind of trying to tell them the good news. And he says, hey, actually, it's worth thinking about this. What is he going to say? What would you say? I had a student once who, this is one of the best descriptions of this I've ever heard. He's going to tell them that it's time to get real, that you're living a lie, that you're living a world of illusions and lies, and it's not real. And indeed, there's a whole world beyond your experience that you can barely imagine. You're being kept in the dark, and there's a world of light. Your world is flat and 2-dimensional, and there's a world of a 3-dimensional world with depth. And what would be their reaction? Well, Plato says, wouldn't they ridicule him? Wouldn't they laugh at him? So this is actually an important detail. Plato suggests that the prisoners play a game, and the object of the game is to name and identify the shadows. And the person who's best able to name and identify the shadows is deemed the wisest man in the cave and has honors bestowed upon him. I saw a teacher once, he called this cave jeopardy. But how good is this freed prisoner who's experienced the light, returned to the cave, how good is he going to be at cave jeopardy? Well, not very, right? Because his eyes are adjusted to the darkness. Or excuse me, his eyes are adjusted to the light. And so he can't see as well in the darkness. And he's experienced so many things since he left the cave that maybe he's forgotten the shadows. But mainly his eyes are adjusted to the light, and so he can't see as well in the dark. And so naturally they're going to think, I don't know what happened to you when they dragged you away from here, but whatever it was, it couldn't have been good, because it appears that you've ruined your eyesight and come and return to us a blind man and a raving madman talking about all kinds of nonsense. And so naturally they laugh at him, they ridicule him, they mock him, and they do not take They do not take him seriously. And worse, they don't only ridicule him, they also threaten him. That is, there's this line towards the end where Plato says, if somebody were to try to release another and bring him to light, let them only catch the offender, and they would put him to death. There's I imagine assume sort of an homage to Plato's teacher Socrates there. So we'll learn about this in the next couple of weeks, that Socrates was Plato's teacher and mentor, famously tried, convicted, sentenced to death, and executed by the city-state of Athens for the practice and teaching of philosophy. That is, roughly, he was a truth teller, killed because he could not hold his tongue. And likewise, you have this freed prisoner who's threatened with death if he doesn't hold his. Okay, so that is the allegory of the cave. Excuse me. I want my marker to dry out. All right, so by now you should be able to give kind of an accurate summary of the story. I think I've included most of the pertinent details. You do have to mind the details here. The details really matter. But now, let's have an analysis of the symbolism. This is an allegory. So an allegory is a symbolic story. It comes from the Greek, meaning speaking of something else. And so Plato is speaking of something else other than the surface meaning or literal meaning in this story. He's trying to convey some deeper meaning about, well, the nature of knowledge, the nature of reality. And what is it he's trying to say here? Well, in honesty, like if you look this up in an encyclopedia or something, you'll find that Plato's trying to say something about his theory of forms, or his theory of ideas, which is an essential idea in Plato's philosophy. At this level, we don't need to concern ourselves with that. But he's also talking about education. That is, Socrates, who tells this story to Plato's brother Glaucon in the Republic, they're speaking on the themes of education and whether or not and to what extent people are enlightened and how they would be enlightened. And so I want you to think about this as a story about education and the nature of education. I want you to think about this as a story of knowledge and ignorance. And the easiest thing, though, is let's just kind of go through the individual symbols and think about what they might represent. We'll start with the prisoners. What do you think the prisoners represent? Well, they're living in ignorance. They're complacent. They're unable to stand up for themselves. They're unable to think for themselves. They're not free. They just sort of blindly, uncritically accept what they're shown. All they really know is what's right in front of their faces. They're completely ignorant of any world outside of their own experience. And so that's who the prisoners are. They're the ignorant people, the uneducated people, the unenlightened people. And really, for Plato, that's us. Plato, in fairness, was an elitist. He thought that the vast majority of people were ignorant, unenlightened, uneducated. And that's who these prisoners are. They're the uneducated, unenlightened masses. Well, and then, if that's right, then what are the shadows? Well, if the prisoners represent the uneducated, and the shadows are what they believe, then the shadows must be the opinions of the uneducated, or the beliefs of the uneducated. There's a Greek word for this, actually. It's doxa. So doxa means like opinion or belief, which is contrasted with episteme, which means knowledge. And so, okay, so the prisoners are the uneducated masses. The shadows are the opinions of the uneducated masses. Then, if that's right, what are the puppeteers? I mean, if the puppeteers are the ones making the shadows, and the shadows are the opinions of the masses, then the puppeteers must be the opinion makers. And I'd ask you to think a little bit about this. Like, who are the opinion makers in our society? Who are the ones who, indoctrinate and brainwash the masses? Who are the ones who tell people what to believe? Nowadays, students tell me, well, those are, what are they called? They're influencers. They're, so I guess, social media influencers, or I would say like preachers, politicians, public school teachers. Believe me, the irony of this isn't lost on me. I mean, how much does this situation in the cave resemble the average American classroom, with the students sitting dutifully at their desks in neat little rows, looking at the wall in front of them, passively absorbing whatever the public employee shows them, and accepting that as knowledge. Also, this is also worth thinking about. How much does this situation in the cave resemble the average American living room, where people are sitting in a dimly lit room, in like a near coma, passively absorbing what's being presented to them on a flickering screen in front of them? And so, so this is, I don't know, the talking heads on TV, or public school teachers, or politicians, or social media influencers, or, I don't know, priests and pastors and religious figures, and anybody whose job it is to sort of indoctrinate the masses. That's the puppeteers. Okay, so the prisoners are the uneducated masses, the shadows are the opinions of the uneducated masses, and the puppeteers are the opinion makers. Okay, well then, what does this freed prisoner represent? Well, this is somebody who's being educated. This is somebody who's becoming what? A free and independent thinker, or a critical thinker. Somebody who's escaping this world of slavery and indoctrination and becoming free and independent thinker, a critical thinker, a philosopher, learning to think for himself and stand on his own 2 feet. I think it helps if you kind of contrast the two models of education here, right? So I told you this situation in the cave kind of resembles the average American classroom, where the student is sort of a passive learner, sort of passively absorbing whatever information is shown to him and uncritically accepting it as true. But this freed prisoner, he's also being educated, but he's being educated in a different way. He's being asked to question what he's been shown. He's being forced to think for himself. And that process is much more difficult and arduous, but in the end much better, because he's free and he knows the truth. You see, this model of education inside the cave, it's the banking model of education, in which the teacher is the expert who dispenses information, and the students' heads are like empty vaults in which the instructor is making deposits of knowledge. But this freed prisoner, he's an active learner, learning to think for himself. So if the passive learning model is teachers putting ideas into the student's head, then the active learning model is teachers drawing ideas out of their students' heads. Socrates, as teacher, compared himself to a midwife. So if you think about the midwife helping the mother give birth, the midwife's not doing much. It's the mother who's giving birth who's doing all the work, and all the midwife can really say is push and breathe. And likewise, the teacher's like that. The student's the one who has to do the thinking and the learning and the work, and the best the teacher can do is say push. Or the best the teacher can do is kind of give them a direction and a push, you see. So there's this great quote from Plutarch that sort of summarizes the kind of point I'm trying to make here, that education is more like the kindling of a flame than the filling of a vessel. So a good teacher is trying to spark your curiosity, not indoctrinate you, you see. And so there's that. And I would say that's actually the main point I want you to take away from this. Gosh, there are so many other things. Oh, I point this out to you. Notice that there's two kinds of movements happening in this story. There's a movement from dark to light, out of the dark into the light. That is, this is a journey of enlightenment. And there's an ascending, there's an upward movement, a movement from below to above. And think about the symbolism of dark and light and the symbolism of ascending, or the symbolism of upward movement. These sort of symbols, they're so obvious, it's almost impossible to explain them. So what do dark and light symbolize? Well, dark symbolizes ignorance and bad things, but really it's not knowing. And light symbolizes good things and knowledge. Actually, for Plato, those are related. That is, Plato probably incorrectly thought that evil was a form of ignorance. People did bad things because they didn't know any better. They had convinced themselves that they were good things, and that if they knew better, they would be better. I don't know if that's right or not, probably not. But anyway, so dark symbolizes not knowing, and light symbolizes knowing. And you could see why that would be. I mean, if you were scared of the dark when you were a kid, why was the dark scary? Well, because you didn't know what was in it. If you couldn't see in the dark, for all you knew, there might be monsters there. If you had a nightlight, at least you would know the monsters were coming. Likewise, light symbolizes knowledge. We speak this way, right? So if you don't understand something, then you're in the dark. Or if somebody's keeping the truth from you, then they're keeping you in the dark. And once you understand, you see. Right? You see the light. You've been made enlightened. That is, seeing is a metaphor for understanding, because our primary sense is visual. That's how we understand our world. And so, if we're in the dark, we're ignorant, we can't see. And if we gain knowledge, then we become enlightened, we can see. This is so obvious. Like, you see a cartoon, right, and the light bulb goes off over the cartoon character's head. We all know right away what that represents. That represents that the character has understood something. They've had a flash of light. They've seen. Okay, and so light symbolizes knowing, and dark symbolizes ignorance. And so there's a movement out of the dark into the light. This is a journey of enlightenment, a journey of education, a gaining of knowledge. Okay, now what about the ascending? The cave is below the ground. So let me back up. So notice the cave is dark. The world outside the cave is light. The shadows are dark, the fire is light. The shadows are dark, the reflections are light. The night sky is dark, the day sky is light. So repeatedly, from dark to light. Same thing with the ascending. The prisoners are kneeling, and then one is compelled to stand up. The cave is below the ground. The world outside the cave is above the ground. The journey out of the cave is a journey up a steep and rugged ascent. The shadows and the reflections are below the horizon on the ground, and so the prisoner starts by looking down, and then the actual objects are on the horizon straight ahead, and then finally the prisoner turns his head up to the heavens and looks into the sky. And so again, there's this ascending, this upward movement. And think about what that means. I mean, if you're sad, what do we say? That you're down in the dumps, that you're depressed, and that you need something uplifting. If the society is preventing you from being successful and thriving, what do we say? That the man is keeping you down, that you're being oppressed, and that you need to rise up, you see. And so think about what it means to ascend, and to rise up, and to be uplifted. And so there's that happening. Okay, so moving out of the dark into the light, and an ascending. we understand this too, right? Like God in heaven are up there, and the devil in hell are down there. Like, okay, so all this is kind of obvious. Okay. Oh boy, there's so much more. The main thing is this sort of journey of enlightenment in education, the two models of education, the symbolism of dark and light, the ascending. But there's more. I give you just kind of one more thing, and then I'll have to wrap this up because I've already said too much. This story, The Allegory of the Cave, it probably reminds you of some story you've heard before. That is, this story is so much a part of our culture and our tradition that, like, it's familiar to you. Even if you've never heard it before, like, it's the kind of story where even if you've never heard it before, you feel like you've heard it before. It's familiar. The themes are recognizable to us. And so if you've never heard this exact story, you've heard lots of stories like it. I'll give you a few examples. The movie The Matrix. Neo is living in a world of illusion in the Matrix. That's the world inside the cave. And then Neo is given, I think, is it the red pill or the blue pill? I think it's the red pill. And then leaves the Matrix and sees the world as it actually is. And so this freed prisoner is Neo taking the red pill. Okay, that's one example. Here's another one. The Truman Show. Right? Truman is living on a movie set, which is the only thing he's ever known. And so naturally he believes that the world on that movie set is the real world. Until finally he comes to appreciate that he's actually living a lie. He's living in an illusory world, and he tries to escape that movie set. Right? So, or any kind of a story where there's a distinction between a world of illusion, the world as it seems to be, and a real world that is different than the world as it seems to be, is thematically similar. So The Matrix, The Truman Show, Inception is like this, Total Recall is like this. I had a student point out to me recently that the Barbie movie is actually like this, because Barbie is living in her Barbie world, and she doesn't understand that reality is actually much different from her Barbie world. And in the Barbie movie, she leaves her Barbie world and goes into the real world and has to come to terms with things as they really are. That's the allegory of the cave. And so it's worth thinking about the two worlds, the world of illusion and the world of reality, and how they contrast. There's more. I think I mentioned Plato's also trying to say something about his theory of forms or his theory of ideas. It's very important and interesting. It's advanced for this class, but if you're really curious, I encourage you to look that up on your own. But anyway, hopefully at this point everybody understands the story a little better. They can accurately summarize it. They can say something intelligent about the themes and the symbolism and what they might mean. And I look forward to seeing what you guys have to say about it in the discussion boards. But for now, that's enough. Thank you very much.